Well, thank you for being at our 8:30 worship service this morning. Glad that you chose to worship with us. If you see me up close, you're going to notice I have a really bright red right eye. I had a busted blood vessel that occurred yesterday morning, and so looks worse than it is. Thankfully, I can see out of it okay, and it's one of those side effects sometimes of wearing contact lenses. A friend of mine asked me yesterday, we were on a phone call, and he said, "How long have you worn contact lenses?" And I said, "I've worn contact lenses longer than you are old." Which makes me feel really old. Sarah Cummins was a 25-year-old pharmacy student at Purdue University and had been planning a dream wedding for 2 years, which was going to be a $30,000 extravaganza. But 1 week before her July 15th wedding was to be held in 2017 in Indianapolis, she called it off, preferring not to give the specific reasons to many people. But due to the late cancellation, the wedding reception venue and the dinner had been paid for in full and was non-refundable. The reception was to be a 170-guest event held at the Ritz-Charles in the suburb of Carmel. While it was too late to get a refund, Cummins decided it wasn't too late to throw a party. She said, "I called everyone, canceled, apologized, cried, called vendors, cried some more, and then I started feeling really sick about just throwing away all the food I'd ordered for the reception," she told the Indy Star newspaper. That's when she decided that rather than letting the food and location go to waste, she would scratch her original guest list and devote the day to feeding the homeless. But the party wouldn't be the only charitable act that would happen that day. As word spread about the event, dresses and suits were donated so the guests would be able to dress for the occasion as well. And so Cummins welcomed dozens of homeless to feast on a meal consisting of meatballs, salmon, goat cheese, roasted garlic bruschetta, and cake. Eric Jenfen, one of the clients from the Wheeler Mission for the Homeless in Indianapolis, told People magazine, "She took a time of her life where she's really sad and kind of lost, and she turned it into a teachable moment for people who are less fortunate. It was an opportunity for us to keep our eyes and our heads up, to realize there's an opportunity for us, that life does exist and revolve outside of homelessness and where we are in life right now." As that party came to an end, all those attending hugged Sarah and reported that she was overwhelmed with their appreciation and that tears flooded her face. A prominent Pharisee invited Jesus to dinner where he was hoping to catch Jesus doing something wrong. Luke 14:1 is the verse. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. Now we're continuing this series, Meals that Jesus had in the Gospel of Luke, and the series is entitled Come Hungry. The Pharisees were often concerned about status, but Jesus was more concerned about serving the needs of others. And Jesus often turned his society's way of thinking upside down, and this is one of those instances. So we're going to see this morning a meal where hearts can be seen, because Jesus is going to reveal in this scenario the true hearts of those who are gathered in the room with him. You know, a meal can be a great place to engage in conversation, share your feelings, your dreams, your hurts. What if you're gathered at a meal and you could read everyone's minds who are sitting there? And of course, they could read your mind as well. In the series, Gilligan's Island, there's an episode from the second season where Gilligan discovers some sunflower seeds on a particular kind of bush on the island, and when eaten, you have the ability to read the minds of others. And there is a scene where Gilligan disappears, returns with a bag of sunflower seeds for everyone to eat so they all can read each other's minds. And they're gathered around a table for their evening meal, but then the castaways go to their individual huts, trying out the seeds to see if they will work. Watch this brief clip between Ginger and Marianne as they read each other's minds.
Oh, is that so? Yes, that's so. And not only that, I'm a what? I'm glad you can read my mind. I'm too much of a lady to say those things. Well, here's something for you. Oh!
I'm not so sure it'd be good if we could read everybody's minds, if what everybody would be thinking. What if you could read the hearts and minds of people around you at a dinner table? Jesus could. He would see both the hearts and the actions that are with those gathered with him at this particular meal. So we're going to notice today a bad practice followed by some good principles by which hopefully we can learn to live within our individual walks with the Lord and then collectively as a church body as well. Now, I will try not to read your mind as you are listening. If you will do the same and try not to read my mind as I am preaching. But I know one of you just thought, is the sermon over yet? Let's look at the bad practice. Before the meal gets underway, there is a teaching moment and there is an object lesson shown to those who are gathered. So Luke 14, and that'll be with verse 2. There in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of his body. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. Then he asked them, if one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out? And they had nothing to say. Now, in the crowd of people was a man with what was then called dropsy. Today it would be called edema. In simple terms, the man is retaining water, which may have indicated a heart disorder, something like congestive heart. And depending on the cause, edema can be very curable, but can also be very fatal. But why is this man at the feast? Most likely he is there as a plant to cause some controversy about Jesus. Because remember, the Pharisees, the legalistic group of the Jews, were always trying to trap Jesus. And when Jesus asked them if it was lawful to heal on the Sabbath, he trapped them. Because to say it was unlawful would make the Pharisees look like they had no compassion, but to say it was lawful would expose their hypocrisy, and their own followers might turn and follow Jesus instead. So their solution is not to have a response of any kind, it's just silence. And Jesus knew this man was most likely being used as a pawn by the Pharisees and sent him away so he wouldn't be caught in the crossfire that is about to occur. And Jesus gives them a scenario. If your child or an ox falls into a well, you would rescue them even if it was on the Sabbath. Now, the Pharisees otherwise would have thought of that being work, and you weren't supposed to work on the Sabbath. But if you leave a stranded child in a well or you leave a stranded animal in a ditch, it would be a horrible situation, nothing short of murder or manslaughter. Now, the man with edema was somebody's son who needed saving even though it was on the Sabbath. If you come to church and you hear a sermon on helping those in distress, and then you drive by somebody with a flat tire on the side of the road and do nothing, did the sermon do what it should? And so Jesus is slowly revealing the hearts of the Pharisees, because underneath their ornate robes and their rules and their pride were hearts riddled with revenge towards Jesus rather than compassion for those who really needed help. When I was a teenager and in my home church youth group, our leaders were Terry and Debbie Ray. They're still very good friends of ours, and Barb and I stayed with them back on our way to Myrtle Beach. They live in the Charlotte area. We're driving down Myrtle Beach last November. We stayed with them one night there at their home. But Terry and Debbie had taken our youth group to play in a softball game at our church camp, Howes Mills Christian Assembly in Ona, West Virginia. I see Dan and Esther Hayden back there, their son-in-law. That would be the church camp that he goes to and their daughter goes to. And down in Ona, it's near Huntington, West Virginia. We used to call it Oh No, West Virginia when we would go. But we were there on a Sunday afternoon playing softball in a church softball league. And just as the game was ending, a huge rainstorm hit and there was a sudden flash flooding. And as we are driving back the 25 miles to the church to make the Sunday evening service in time. How many of you remember Sunday night church? You remember having church? You had to be in church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, all that good stuff. And we're driving back to get there in time. We exited off Interstate 64 towards Ashland, and the ramp had been completely washed away. And there was a car sitting there about 3 feet deep in mud, and inside was a woman and a little girl. And Terry immediately stopped his van, and the 10 or so of us that were in that van got down in that muddy mess, and we were able to get the window of the car open and pull out that lady and her daughter. We loaded them into the van and drove them to a convenient mart where she could call her husband to come get them. There weren't cell phones back in that day. And we arrived at church about half an hour late, and we walked into the service, which was up in the main sanctuary, just as the preacher was starting his Sunday night sermon, and we are all covered in thick, dark mud from head to toe. We just walked right up, sat down near the front row. We had some older people just kind of stare us down as we're walking there. But at the end of church, Terry had all of us walk forward and go up front with him, and we tracked mud all over the carpet in the middle aisle, and he told the story of what happened on our way to church. One of our elders, Jack Moore, stood up and said, "That's great. You all did exactly what you were supposed to do. Now all of you get out in the parking lot, and we're going to hose you down." And they did. They literally took us out in the parking lot and just hosed us off with all that mud. But here is the bad practice that was occurring in that day at meals. Look at verse 7. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give this person your seat." Then humiliated, you'll have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he'll say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you'll be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who humble themselves will be exalted. The Jewish banquet was laid out across a horseshoe-shaped table that was about 6 inches off the ground. And around the table were cushions on which the folks could recline. And the host would sit basically at the top of the horseshoe. And the immediate place of honor would be to his right, and the number 2 seat would be to his left. And this seating chart would go back and forth across the table to the lowest seat. There was a definite pecking order in these feasts. Now, you might get away with sliding up a spot or two to assert your importance, but if you got too audacious, you might be asked to move back, or you might even be asked to leave the room to make room for a more prominent guest, and that would be embarrassing. If you had siblings growing up, and let's say there were 3 of you, and only one of your parents was with you, it'd be like arguing who's going to ride up front with mom. How many of you remember standing on the hump in the back floor between the 2 front seats? Did you ever do that? Yeah, did you do? How many of you rode in the back window of the car? Laid across, you know what? Christian comedian Mark Lowry says, we care way too much for our kids these days. We buckle them in. Said back when we were growing up, Dad would slam on the brakes, and what would happen? If you were in that back window, you'd go to the front window, right across mom and dad. Oh, that's kind of what this was like. It's where were you, and how did you get chosen to pick to be in the main seat? And Jesus is highlighting this ridiculous scene of grown men fighting for positions on cushions. And what does he say? You take the lowest place. Don't draw attention to yourself. Now, Jesus isn't talking just about etiquette at a meal here. He's reminding the Pharisees, and he's reminding us, if we act arrogantly, God just might bring someone along to put us in our place. We may get away with a little bit for a little while, but eventually a childish, self-seeking will gives way sometimes to great embarrassment. And our world today thrives on an insatiable hunger for attention. How many of you have been watching the news and saw the news about last Sunday night's Oscar Awards, the slap heard around the world? What a revealing scenario when Will Smith slapped Chris Rock before hundreds attending the event and millions who were watching it. What an arrogant attitude. What has happened to humility and some human dignity? Can I remind you that God's perspective is so much better than ours? God's way of measuring things is often the opposite of ours. Those who humble themselves here are going to be rewarded in heaven. And God can do that because he judges the heart, whereas we're only able to judge appearances and performances. God knows the heart of each of us and whether our motives are pure or they are poor. And then Jesus instructs the Pharisees how you should use your influence, not just to help oneself, but to help others. Look down at verse 12. Then Jesus said to his hosts, when you give a luncheon or dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Jesus is saying, don't just help those who can help you in return. You help those you know who cannot ever repay you. Now, that was a scandalous statement for that time. The world's attitude was, you only help those from whom you can collect. So I want to encourage you this week, do something for which nobody can repay you. It might be some anonymous deed that you can do behind the scenes and nobody will know even who it was. What's going to be the ultimate example of being helped and can't offer any in return? Well, of course, we know it's going to be Jesus and his death on the cross. You cannot ever repay Jesus for what he's done for you if you're a Christian. You cannot equal the salvation that Jesus can provide in our lives. You cannot match the grace that he gives to us. And this meal, it's a foreshadowing of another one yet to come, the Last Supper, where Jesus would humbly wash the feet of his disciples. Jesus in that meal should have been the guest of honor and had his feet washed. Yet again, he flips the expectation. He bows down and he washes the feet of others. Well, from this bad practice of wanting the prominent seat at a meal comes some good principles that we need to learn. So I want to share just two very simple principles, ones that I hope will help us be more dependent on the Lord and trust him more each day. But I want to apply these in two ways. I want to apply these to each of us personally, but I want us to focus them towards us as a church as well. Here's the first one. Be flexible. Be flexible. Now that needs to be true for us individually. Isn't it easy to get caught in our comfort zones and sometimes be unwilling to budge? You know, it may be something as simple as where we sit in church. I messaged one of our members last week. I said, I almost missed seeing you in church because you were in a different section than usual. And he messaged back, that's because where we normally sit was completely full. And that was at our third service, and they normally sit over here, and I look and they're sitting over there, which really confuses me. Or sometimes some of you will switch a service on me. And that really confuses me. Sometimes we'll have Nick Miller and his family, a lot of times will attend this service and they'll sit right over there. Last week they attended the third service. I went up to them and said, I'm not starting my day over for you. This is the third service. This is not the first service. And so it's easy to get confused. Barb and I had the opportunity to go to one of our sister congregations when we were in Honolulu, Hawaii several years ago. And we went to the later service on Sunday morning, and we arrived early, and we sat down at the end of a row in two chairs. The chairs are just like ours that we have here, and we sat in the very back row, and then an elderly lady using a walker came up to the end of the row where we're seating, and she just stood there, and she just stared at us. I mean, just a glare. And Barb whisked her over and said, I think we have her seat. And the lady said, you do, and I'm not hard of hearing. And we moved over a seat and we sat down, and she then told us how she was a founding member of that congregation. But here was the neat thing. She was 103 years old. 103, and she said, I don't miss church, I'm always at church. And she was always at church as far as I knew, and very gracious lady. But being flexible also applies to us as a church. So we have to be flexible organizationally. Before the pandemic occurred, our elders began looking at our staff structure and how that could be improved. We had a consultant in from E2 Elders, Effective Elders, named Gary Johnson in late 2019. We had flatlined in attendance for about 2 years and even just a slight decline. And while not original with Gary Johnson, he reminded us, if you keep doing things the same way, you'll keep getting the same results. And so one of the emphases we started back at the very beginning of 2020 was invite, just encouraging you to invite others to be in church with you. And you were doing an amazing job. In fact, the first 2 months of 2020, before the pandemic hit, we saw an 8 to 10% increase in attendance from the last few months of 2019. And then, of course, COVID hit in March of 2020. But after prayer, discussion, seeking wisdom from other congregations and from consultants like Gary Johnson, our elders made the decision to begin planning to add another staff position, that of executive pastor. And the role of executive pastor is responsible for implementing and coordinating the strategic ministry systems here at church as we seek to honor our mission statement of connect all people to Jesus and one another. Now, that position's focus will be the big picture of church in relation to the day-to-day operations. So areas of oversight will be things like communication, leadership and ministry development, staffing, facilities, and finance. And the other main thing this role will help do is keeping staff cohesive towards our approaches and our focus. And that's why I'm announcing today that David Brown is going to be moving into that role. And I shared that back in 2019 through my PS Weekly email that we were going to be making plans to make that change. But obviously, if he moves into the role of executive pastor, that leaves an opening in the role of worship pastor. And so late last year, our elders gave the go-ahead to begin that search. And early this year, we posted the opportunity, and we had an outstanding candidate applied. After multiple Zoom interviews with David, myself, the elders, later on an in-person interview with our staff, elders, deacons, and worship team, the elders and deacons have unanimously extended a call, and the candidate has accepted. And Jake Miller will begin with us on Sunday, May the 15th, in the role of worship and creative arts pastor. Show his picture there. Jake is 34. He is currently serving in the same role at a sister congregation in Central Virginia. He announced his resignation there last Sunday morning. He is married to Michaela. Now, when you see her name, it's going to look like Michaela, but it's pronounced Michaela. And they have one son, Luca, who's going to be 2 years old this July, and they're expecting their second child in early August, a girl. And so if we don't have it by attrition growth, we have it by biological growth. They can come. But Jake, some of you will know a little bit of his history, or at least some connections with it. Jake was baptized in a pond near the Old Stone Church of Christ over here in Newark. And he grew up attending the Rocky Fork Church of Christ during his middle school years, and later the Crossroads Christian Church during his high school years. Now, his original plans were to be a music educator, and he had already been accepted at Ohio University. But during a week of Summer in the Sun, that's S-O-N, not S-U-N, at Kentucky Christian College, following his senior year of high school, after he went to that week, which is an emphasis on following God's call in your life, he decided that he wanted to change plans, and he felt God calling him to pursue a full-time vocational ministry. So Jake was flexible in what he had planned to do, yet allowing God to also give a call in his own life. And Jake and I actually started in a master's program together about 10 years ago. He finished it in the 3 years they want you to. I crammed mine into the 7-year program. So he's a lot smarter than I am. But Jake and his wife met when she was working a summer camp in Virginia. They were married back in October of 2017. Michaela is originally from California. They're both looking forward to being closer to family. Jake's mother attends the Licking Valley Church of Christ in Newark, where one of our former staff members, Steve Harley, is now the new senior minister. One of his piano teachers was the same one that Kim Barker of our church had. So there's some connection there. Now, I share all this as a way of communication and information, but also because we have to be flexible. When Jake arrives, he and David are going to be sharing the worship leading for a period of probably about 3 or 4 months. There's going to be overlap in their roles until they each acclimate. Jake is going to lead differently. He's going to organize differently. David's going to be taking on a role that is new to us, and there'll be adjustments to make. It'll be a struggle for some. But continually doing methods the same way can ultimately be the death of a church. Now, you know who's going to struggle the most? Me. I'm the old guy. I'm the old person on staff. I'm older. I'm more set in my ways. I've been here a long time. But I know, and you know, with the anticipated growth of this area, we need to be preparing ourselves to present the gospel to more people than ever before. Now, let me mention that we are still searching for a student minister, and we have been for over a year. The pool of candidates for student and youth ministers is dry. We have some wonderful volunteers who are helping, and we are still looking, and that position is still available. And so we're trying to be flexible as well. That role may move to include senior high and young adults, so the transition is made from high school to college to career. We can better minister to them. And some of you sitting out there might be someone hearing this today who knows of someone who has experience in that ministry area who could possibly fulfill this role. So I want you, if you know of someone, you let me know. Let me or David know. But I want you to pray this week that God will send that person to us. Hundreds of us praying for the same goal, and let's see what God can do and who He can provide. But being flexible also applies to how our church prepares, responds, and ministers to a growing community. You know, with the recent announcement of the Intel facility being built just a few miles from us, the number of people flooding this area is going to be enormous. And there are going to be a lot of challenges ahead. We already know with our community there's going to be infrastructure issues, traffic issues, there's going to be a shortage on housing, there's going to be a need for many more small businesses, and we're going to see changes in the next 5 to 10 years unlike we have seen in the last 20 to 30. And personally, you may struggle with all the changes that are going to be occurring in the area. But folks, as a church, we cannot miss the huge open door God is providing. Some community leaders have suggested that Licking County could now double in population in the next 5 years and then double again the following 5. This past school year in September, we opened our new preschool, Tri-Village Christian Academy. And already for next year, we have the number of students enrolled almost equal to what we currently have today. And we are doubling the class capacity for next year. And we really are projecting that probably by the end of July, we're going to be maxed out with that new doubling of capacity. And that need is going to increase only exponentially with the projected growth of this area. So I'm talking about a meal where hearts can be seen. Let's talk about our hearts, because we're not talking about your church. We're not talking about my church. We're talking about the Lord's church. And Jesus' approach about coming into the kingdom was this. Listen to these words in Mark 9, beginning at verse 35. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." And the most compassionate thing we can do is to get as many people as possible into the kingdom of God, because their eternal destiny depends on it. Let's not worry about appearance and status and career, but let's do everything we can to make sure the hearts of those coming here belong to Jesus Christ. We have to learn to be flexible. Here's the second principle, again, a very simple one to say, more complicated to do. Be humble. Be humble. Notice that Jesus didn't want people deliberately sitting at a place of honor. If it was offered to them, he did not condemn them for taking it. The Pharisees didn't want to humble themselves. The disciples didn't want to humble themselves. And sometimes Christians are not very good at doing it either. It is easy for us to get into a mindset of entitlement. Whether it's where we park, where we sit, the type of music we like, the style of worship service we prefer, how money should be spent. But being humble acknowledges with every part of us that we believe God is to be the ultimate authority in our lives. And we recognize that humility is not thinking less of others, it's thinking less of ourselves. Charles William Beebe was a naturalist and a scientist from Columbia University in the 1920s. He was good friends with Theodore Roosevelt. And when Charles would visit the home of the former president, they would walk outside at night and search the skies for a certain spot of light near the lower left-hand corner of the great square of the Pegasus constellation. And then they would recite, "This is the spiral galaxy in Andromeda. It is as large as our Milky Way. It is one of 100 million galaxies. It consists of 100 billion suns, each larger than our sun." Then President Roosevelt would grin and say, "Now I think we are small enough. Let's turn in for the night." The humblest of all the people in this passage in Luke 14 was Jesus. And yet he's the one who created the galaxies. While the Pharisees felt they were too good to pull out an animal or their own children from a well on the Sabbath, Jesus wasn't too proud to reach down inside that well and perform a rescue. And Jesus will never leave the well until every last person who is willing to follow him is rescued. Christ-like humility for us, as individuals and as a church, requires that we never forget those who are trapped in wells and needing rescued. None of us is too good, too holy, too important, too successful, too prominent, too valuable to help hurting people out of the well. I was reading a book this past week entitled Eats with Sinners by Aaron Chambers, and I love what he says. He says, "Would you remind yourself of this fact? We are all just former Wellians." That's a play on words if you're catching on there. Some of you will catch that. And he said, Jesus came along and he rescued you and me. And Jesus said, "For those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who are humble will themselves be exalted." And then he made his way to the cross where he could be humiliated so we could be rescued. Now, David mentioned there are green cards on your seat. These cards are for you to write down this morning praises to God where you've seen him working in your life, in the lives of others, or in the life of our church. It might just be a word or two. It might be a phrase. It might be a whole paragraph. Whatever it is for you. It can be very humbling sometimes just to take a practical step to remind ourselves of how God can work and rescue. So I want you to do that here in just a moment. I'm going to pray in just a moment, and then after I pray, there's going to be a song entitled, "Here's My Heart." And during that song, we want you to fill out those green cards, and as you leave by either door, there are baskets where you can place those. And then after the song ends, we'll be sharing in communion together, again reminding us how Jesus was willing to humble himself. So as you have opportunity to fill out those green cards, it's a good reminder of who God is and who we are in relation to him. And maybe it's just another reminder that we are nothing but just a bunch of Wellians who need rescued. Let's pray. Father, this morning, as we come to be reminded of Jesus' humility upon the cross, may the same type of humility be in our lives as well. May the flexibility be there that needs to occur when there are a lot of different changes coming, whether they be changes within our local church, or they be changes within our local community, or they be changes in our own life and how we respond to those. Help us to not only be flexible, but help us to be humble. Humble for the people maybe you put in our lives that help correct us and help encourage us in our daily walk with you. People you put into our lives who come along and just wrap their arms around us to say, you're needed and it's appreciated for what you do. As Herb shared earlier in the service this morning about the Stephen ministry, sometimes people just need a listening ear. And there are people who have willingly been flexible and willingly been humble to listen to the needs of others and to give the love of Christ in various ways. So God, we don't know what opportunities you're going to give us as a church in the next decade or so, but it certainly seems there would be a lot of them ahead of us. May we be willing to see where you will lead, and may we follow faithfully. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.